One night, while my brother and our parents were in the living room, I approached them. I politely inquired when I'd also be registering for my college education, but the first reply I got was a resounding slap from my father. "That's for daring to dream of going to college like my son."
We have no plans to fund your education any longer. Our son needs it more.
My chest felt heavy with sadness. Was I not their child too? Why didn't I deserve to be in college? Right from the time we were kids, I've always been shown by my parents who their favorite child was. My name is Jason, a 27-year-old banker who had a very rough childhood. Now, you must be thinking it started when my brother was born. Well, guess what? It didn't. I was 3 when my brother was born, and from the little I can recall, I was unloved before then. I was always left at home with my nanny while they went out having fun. When my brother was finally born, it got worse. They barely spoke to me. All attention was on my brother. He took everything, including my nanny. My mother barely went out like she used to, but she still thought my brother needed the nanny more than me. From the tender age of 4, I began doing basic things myself, though the nanny assisted me a little whenever she could. My parents thought I didn't deserve to be ahead of my brother in our academics, so for 2 whole years, they pretended that I was too sick to go to school. My grandparents, who were living in a country far away from us, visited our home one day. The day before, my mother had forced me to take some drugs that led to me stooling and vomiting uncontrollably for 3 straight days. I was just 5. My parents felt so much pity for their poor grandson and gave some money to my parents to take me to a different and more experienced hospital. I saw tears dropping from my parents' eyes as they took the money, thanking my grandparents. 2 days later, I heard they'd traveled back. It seemed like the best news my parents got, aside from the extra money my grandparents had given them again. Throughout that year, they continuously extorted money from my grandparents, using my health as an excuse. When my brother was finally 5, I was 7, and that was when I was finally pronounced healed and allowed to start school. I was forced to go at the same pace as my brother. As a result, we got into high school together and finished together. Life in high school was hell. Seeing how unfairly my parents treated me, my brother followed in their footsteps. We looked alike and had the same surnames, so we were often associated together by our peers, but my brother didn't like that. It made him angry. He refused to sit beside me and barely talked to me at school. To make matters worse, he would beat me up with his friends. Once when they beat me up, I resolved to report him to my parents. Their replies shocked my soul.
Brothers play like that. You should consider yourself lucky that he even plays with a person as ugly as you.
How dare you complain? You should be happy. I couldn't understand why they told to be happy about my brother bullying me. How could they be so delusional? It went on until we finally graduated from high school. On our graduation day, I was utterly embarrassed by my parents. I was awarded the best student in arts while my brother took his for sciences. I was called out first. While everyone cheered for me, I could see my parents' unimpressed looks from where I stood. After receiving my award, I returned to my seat, which was in a row behind theirs. They refused to let me sit with them. Once his name was called out, my parents let out the loudest scream, hugging him and clapping excitedly as he walked out. While he was receiving the award, my mom's loud voice echoed through the whole hall. "That's my son." It felt awkward because most people knew I was also her son, but I didn't get even a little reaction during my moment. When it was time for pictures, my parents took as much as my brother wanted with him, but when I tried to go up and take some with them, they stopped me.
Get lost. I don't want your ugly face next to mine.
"You must be bold to think you could take pictures with us with that face of yours." I was unsure of so many things, but one thing I was certain of is that I wasn't ugly. Not to brag, but I look better than my brother. After high school, my parents informed me that I was old enough to start taking care of myself, and the only thing they could afford to give me was a roof over my head. It came as a shock to me until I got starved for 2 days. On the 3rd day, while the 3 of them were away on an outing, our maid gave me some food and asked me to eat it quickly before they arrived. I was forced to go out in search of a job. After a week, I finally found one as a part-time worker at a popular restaurant. Luckily for me, even though the pay wasn't great, it came in on a weekly basis. In that way, I was able to feed myself. Meanwhile, my brother, they didn't expect anything from my brother. In fact, they even gave him an allowance, and yet he never did a single chore. They even paid for all of his clothes, and when he was old enough, they got him a new car. There I was, working my ass off while my brother enjoyed living life on Easy Street. When it was time for college, my parents didn't hesitate to register him at a popular and expensive school to study biochemistry. My dream was to be an architect, so I wanted to study architecture. One night, while my brother and our parents were in the living room, I approached them. I politely inquired when I'd also be registering for my college education. The first reply I got was a resounding slap from my father. "That's for daring to dream of going to college like my son."
We have no plans to fund your education any longer. Our son needs it more.
My chest felt heavy with sadness. Was I not their child too? Why didn't I deserve to be in college? I had questions to ask them, but my mouth was refusing to cooperate with me. Holding the cheek where I got slapped, I walked away to my room, my eyes burning from the tears. As I turned on my phone, I realized that the voice recorder had been on and had captured everything. I didn't want to keep it, but I couldn't delete it. After that, I got even more serious with my job, and even got myself a second part-time job. Soon, I'd gathered some money to start my college education. I couldn't go to a grand one like my brother, but I was satisfied. 3 months later, my parents called me into the living room. "We need money for your brother's school. Give us your salary." That angered me. They refused to be responsible for me, and I was forced to do everything for myself, and they dared to ask for my hard-earned money. I refused. I told them I didn't care about whatever my brother needed. I had things I wanted to use my money for. They flared up. In their words, I was nothing but a stingy brat who thought the world gave a damn about him. I discreetly turned on my sound recorder. I replied to them that I didn't care about whether the world recognized me. I reminded them of how badly they'd been treating me and how I'd been forced to do everything all by myself. I'm so depressed. I fight suicidal thoughts every day because, irrespective of how you both treat me, I wouldn't want you to lose a child.
Well, we want it. Die, Jason, die if you want. We feel ashamed already having a useless and ugly thing like you to call a child. Die.
I'd never felt so broken. At that moment, my whole life crumbled before me. My knees nearly failed me. Without a word, and with tears streaming down my eyes, I stormed out of the house. "Don't return here without the money!" It was already late. With no idea of where I was going, I continued walking until I tiredly dropped on the ground by the side of the road. Seeing everyone's eyes on me, I stood up and went into a nearby restaurant. As I took my seat, I dropped my hands on the table, buried my face between them, and cried my eyes out. After crying, I lifted my head again. I didn't want to leave yet, so I ordered a cup of juice to pass time. While scrolling through my social media newsfeed, I came across a post of a lady going through something similar to my predicament. I dropped a comment to clear my mind too. In the comment, I told her how my parents were just like hers and what transpired that night. I added the 2 voice recordings, and I asked her to be strong and assured her that she'd be fine soon. Barely 10 minutes later, my phone began blowing up with different notifications. People were replying to my comments and sharing the voice recordings. They expressed how unfair my parents were, and some others shared their stories too. In 20 minutes, it went viral. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to delete the post, but there was no way that could help. Right there, I got a call from my grandmother, demanding if what I posted was true. I had no choice but to confess all my parents had been doing to me, right from the beginning. My grandmother was furious. I learned that, from the time they told her I was sick, she'd taken it upon herself to take care of me. Since my parents didn't have jobs, she took care of them too. She couldn't believe my parents would do such a thing to their child. She promised to be at our house the next day. Right after I got off the phone with her, my mom called. I suspected that she'd seen the post and didn't pick up. My father and brother called too, but I didn't pick up. That night, I spent the night at a hotel. The next day, my grandmother called to inform me that she was at my parents'. I left the hotel and headed home to see my parents and brother on their knees in front of her. They begged for my forgiveness, but I refused. "I'm sorry, but none of you deserve my forgiveness." My grandmother supported me. She asked me to pack my things and go with her to Canada. I didn't waste any time obeying her. That night, despite my parents' pleas and cries, I followed my grandmother. Now you must be thinking they realized their mistakes, and that's why they were begging. Far from it. They knew if I left, they wouldn't be getting any money from my grandmother anymore. They were too afraid of that happening, and I knew it, which made me hate them even more. For the next 2 years, I went to the best business school. My grandmother put me in charge of all her properties. Unfortunately, she passed away in a fatal plane crash years later. At her funeral, I saw my parents as they had come to pay their final respects. Once again, they begged for my forgiveness. I reminded them of my promise to never forgive them even after death. I returned to Canada after the burial and took charge of my grandmother's businesses while still going to school. My parents started calling and emailing me to start sending them money like my grandmother used to. They called me several times, but I refused to answer their calls. Later on, I changed my number, making it impossible to get a hold of me. A month later, they found the company and came there to beg me in person. I was surprised to see how much they'd changed, looking so tattered and unkempt. I showed them how irritated I was and warned them to never show their faces to me again. I had the security guards throw them out. 1 week later, I was informed that my house had been robbed and some of my belongings had been stolen. I alerted the police immediately, and an intense investigation began. From the CCTV camera, they discovered the thieves, my family. I immediately ordered that they find them. 3 days later, they were found at the airport, on their way back home. They were instantly arrested. They begged desperately that I do not press charges on them, but I refused not to. They were taken to court, where all 3 of them were charged with burglary and theft. Everything they stole amounted to $6,000. They were each given 10 years in prison. I couldn't be happier. My younger sister was the absolute favorite. She was always doted on since the day she was born. It got worse, though, after her first beauty pageant when she was 2 years old. She won the crown and stole every drop of my mother's affection from then on. My name is Jaden, and my childhood was horrible. It was just the 3 of us: Mom, me, and Gabriella. My younger sister was the absolute favorite. She was always doted on since the day she was born. It got worse, though, after her first beauty pageant when she was 2 years old. She won the crown and stole every drop of my mother's affection from then on. There were pictures of her on stages winning sashes and tiaras all over the mantle and fridge. Not a single photo of me. It got worse once I was 9 and she was 6.
Jaden, we need more space to store all of Gabriella's pageantry costumes. I'm just going to put them in your room. You don't mind, do you?
I told her I did mind. A lot. That was my room. Gabriella already had her own bigger bedroom with a walk-in closet. How many clothes did she really need?
Well, she's actually doing something with her life, making a name for herself and networking with powerful people. And besides, it's my house. I'm just letting you use your room out of the goodness of my heart.
I pointed out that I was only 9, but she didn't care. Precious Gabriella had already won a full shelf of awards, become friends with rich kids who could take her on expensive trips, all while she was younger than me. I told her I still had my whole life ahead of me to become successful.
Don't be stupid. You'll never amount to anything. You've already missed the boat.
That year, my family forgot my 10th birthday. When I woke up that Saturday morning, I couldn't smell pancakes cooking or any of my favorite breakfasts. I went downstairs and saw no decorations. My mother was making oatmeal, my least favorite, but just enough for one person. I looked at the table and saw Gabriella in her pre-pageant sweatpants and t-shirt, hair all done up with glitter and pigtails and pearls.
Oh, there you are, Jaden. Cut up the fruit for your sister's breakfast.
I was too stunned to speak. I picked up the knife and started cutting strawberries. With each slice, I realized this wasn't a joke. They had really forgotten. I wasn't special enough to them for them to even remember the day I was born. After I was done making my sister's breakfast, they left in the car, leaving me all alone in the empty house. I searched the house for presents. Nothing. They didn't even come back that night, Mom ignoring my calls. I had to fend for myself for dinner, a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, and cried myself to sleep. Happy birthday to me. When they came back the next afternoon, Mother acted like they hadn't done anything wrong.
We were supposed to come back last night, but your sister was so tired from winning the competition, so I booked us a hotel room. I'm sure you didn't mind.
I told her she could have at least called and told me. Answered one of my many calls.
We were too busy at the celebration party afterwards. It slipped my mind. You're a big kid after all. You were fine.
By this time, more than half my room was full of my sister's stuff. bags of too small dresses, boxes and boxes of toys that didn't fit in her own room, and other things my mother bought her just because. The walls of stuff were creeping in on me. They made it so I couldn't find my homework sometimes.
I got a call from the school. You didn't turn in your homework again. What is wrong with you? You're worthless. Why can't you be more like your sister and be gifted at something?
I told her I had done my homework. I had just lost it in all the stuff in my room. She didn't believe me and locked me in my bedroom until I could apologize properly for making her day worse. The walls of clutter surrounded me, seeming to move closer and closer. I couldn't breathe. My hands were shaking and my breathing hurt. There was no way I was going to be able to find my homework and prove to her I had done it while I was having a panic attack. Besides, even if I did find it, it wouldn't change the fact that I had ruined her day already because of the phone call from the school. Minutes turned into hours. I made myself as small as possible in a corner on my bed to try and get away from the looming piles of things that represented my sister. My own neglect. At last, after dinner, Mom let me out.
Well, what do you have to say for yourself?
I swallowed back tears, breathing the fresh air coming in from the open door. I told her I never wanted her to do that again, to please believe me that I had done my homework. She scoffed, slapped me, and locked me in again. I couldn't take it. I had had enough. I moved piles of boxes from the window, kicked out the screen, and climbed out. Running away from home was my only option. But where could I go? Remembering my uncle's address, I ran for it. It was a couple of miles away, and it started to rain on me. But I persisted. Over an hour later, with my hair stuck to my forehead and clothing dripping wet, I knocked on his door. "Jaden, what are you doing here? Come in, come in." I explained everything that had happened. He gave me my own room and helped me get better from the cold I caught from running in the rain. Life with Uncle Duran was the complete opposite of what it had been in my mom's house. It was the first time I remembered anyone ever helping me when I was sick. He celebrated my birthday and got me a basketball. It was a brand new one, perfect and just for me. Each thump as it bounced off the pavement was music to my ears. Uncle Duran practiced with me on the driveway for hours on the weekends until I got good. Each call of support from Uncle Darren as he practiced with me made my heart soar. He'd give me pointers and help me sign up to try out for a team. I worked hard in school. Only Uncle Darren showed up for my graduation. After high school, I got a basketball scholarship for the college of my choice. Full ride. I didn't tell my mom or sister though, just Uncle Duran. "I am so proud of you, Jaden. You've earned this." After college, I was drafted onto a professional team. I had a great starting salary and was a star player. I could make free throws, layups, and dunk like no one's business. Our championship games were on television, broadcast for the whole world to see. A week before the championship finals, a reporter came to interview me. She wanted to do a story about me and the struggles that I had growing up, and so I told her all about how my mother had prioritized my sister over me and how she abused me, and I was forced to run away and live with my uncle. But that had been the best decision that I had ever made, as it set my life on a much better trajectory. While I told her how my mom locked me in my room, the reporter almost broke down in tears. A few days later, I woke up and checked my phone and saw hundreds of notifications from random people. The story was going viral, and people were cheering me on for overcoming my struggles and for running away from a very toxic and evil mother. I could only assume that while I was getting so much support from people that my mother was getting the exact opposite, but I honestly didn't care. On the night of the championship finals, an argument started up on the side of the court just before the start of the game.
"That's my son. Jaden is my child. Jaden, you need to help us."
An older woman and a college-age girl were yelling at an usher. I looked over and did a double take. It was my mom dressed in cheap, worn clothing. I wasn't sure why all of a sudden she finally came to find me after all these years, but I suspected that it had something to do with the story about me. My sister Gabriella was with her too. Gabriella was no longer the bubbly beauty of her pageant days. Instead, she looked like she had gotten in with the wrong crowd, her cheeks too hollow and eyes too sunken. I'd heard about what drugs could do to people, and that's exactly what they had described. I was shocked when she spoke.
"Jaden, if you don't retract the story, people will continue to make our lives a living hell."
And of course, They had only come to see me because the truth had come out, and now they were facing repercussions for all the abuse that they had put me through. It made me sick that they still only cared about their own needs. The usher told them to stay put and came up to me. "Sorry about this, Jaden. Do you know these two? They claim to be your family and want to speak with you." I looked the two women in the eye and said to the usher, "I don't know them. They're no family of mine." Both of the girls squawked in indignance.
How dare you, Jaden? After all I did for you.
You selfish loser. I wish Mom had had an abortion instead of giving birth to you.
I turned my back on them and went onto the basketball court. It was the best game I had ever played. The ball flew from teammate to teammate, the crowd roaring in excitement. Uncle Duran cheered us on from his special spot on the side. I had gotten revenge on my mother and sister. I had escaped their world and not let them invade mine. I later found out that Gabriella had been addicted to drugs prior to the story coming out, but after it did, she began to do them way more and was in constant danger of overdosing. My mother was forced to spend all of her money on trying to get her into rehab, but it never worked. After a bit, they were forced to leave the country as people continued to attack them because of the story. The last that I heard about them, they were living in another country and were struggling with bills. I can only assume just how miserable their lives had become. I even heard both of them are now janitors and are struggling to survive. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe.
Just then, my mother-in-law came out of the jungle and began laughing at me.
See, now this is what you deserve. You want to act like an animal with my son and go off and get pregnant. Then that's how I'm going to treat you. Now look at you, you're helpless.
You must be completely insane. You're going to regret this. Just then, some officers came out of the jungle with their weapons drawn, and they snuck up behind my mother-in-law. Hey there, my name is Maria, and boy do I have a story to tell. Basically, my story ends with me going to the hospital because of my mother-in-law's insanity. But let me not get too ahead of myself here. Let me start from the very beginning. I was living with my husband Carl, and we had just discovered that I was pregnant. When I initially told Carl about the pregnancy, his reaction was much less enthusiastic than I would have wanted.
"You're pregnant? We aren't ready for this. I thought you were on birth control."
I am, but sometimes it doesn't work. Aren't you happy?
"No, I'm not happy. I'm disappointed and I feel deceived."
I was horrified that Carl thought that I had purposely gotten pregnant because I was telling the truth. I was on birth control, but even if you take every measure possible to prevent it, sometimes it can still happen. Even though we hadn't been trying to have a baby, I found that I was rather excited about it. I knew that even though my pregnancy was not on purpose, I was still going to love my child no matter what. After a little bit of convincing, Carl eventually came around to the idea of having a child. He promised he would do all he could to support me and our child, but I wasn't so sure. See, Carl has always been pretty lazy, and he doesn't even have a stable career that he can rely on to bring in good money. I knew better than to ever bring this up to Carl, though, because he would lose his temper and start yelling. Ever since we first met, Carl had never treated me the best. Even on our first date, he yelled at me for ordering the most expensive thing on the menu. But I had decided to stay with him because he was my first love and the only boyfriend I ever had. Anyways, once Carl had come around to the idea of our child, he decided it was time to tell his mother about it. Me and his mother had never got along, and I still remember the first time I met her. Me and Carl had been dating for some time, and she invited me over to her house. But when she saw me through the peephole, she called Carl's cell phone and told us both to leave. She claimed she took one good look at me and could tell what kind of girl I was. Anyways, Carl insisted that I go over to her place and tell her about the pregnancy. He said he would not be able to make it because he would be out looking for a better paying job. I reluctantly agreed and packed my bags for a weekend with my mother-in-law. You see, his mother lives on the other side of the country, so I would have to take a plane to go see her. I didn't like that my husband would not accompany me on this trip, but I accepted it because looking for a better paying job was very important, especially with the baby on the way. The flight to my mother-in-law's house was very long, and I felt so cramped and uncomfortable since most planes have almost no room to stretch out. Coupled with being uncomfortable from my pregnancy, it was the perfect recipe for being sore. Finally, when I landed, I called a taxi and directed them to drop me off at my mother-in-law's house. My mother-in-law has always been a strange person, so I should mention that her house is not your average house. It is in the middle of the jungle, and it is pretty far from the closest village. She moved there a couple years after Carl's dad had died because she couldn't deal with being near all of his old stuff. When I got to her house, I nervously knocked on the door. To my surprise, she opened it immediately and was genuinely surprised to see me. After the shock of seeing me at her door, she invited me inside and actually apologized for her behavior when I'd come to meet her before. I was shocked that she was being so nice and accepted her apology. But her true colors would once again show when it was time to tell her the big news. Well, there is a reason I've come today, actually.
Oh, really? What is that?
I'm pregnant.
You're what? That's disgusting. You should not have been doing that with my son.
What do you mean?
I knew you were a dirty girl. My son does not have the means to be a father right now.
Are you serious? Are you really not excited that you are going to be a grandmother?
Not to your evil baby. I want you out of here immediately. Book the next flight you can get and get out of my house.
I was horrified to hear that my mother-in-law did not approve of our child. I had no idea why she would think that something like this was not possible. After all, I was married to her son. I guess the only explanation is that she had gone somewhat crazy from living out there all by herself for so long. Either way, I began crying and tried to book the earliest flight back home. My anxiety only grew when I saw that the earliest flight didn't leave until the next evening, meaning that I would have to spend the night with my mother-in-law. Upset and crying, I called Carl and told him what had happened. It was horrible. I just wish I was home with you right now.
Well, to be honest, she does have a point.
What do you mean?
It's true that you shouldn't have gotten pregnant. Now be nice to my mother and take care of her. She is the most important woman in the world to me.
I couldn't believe my ears. My own husband was siding with my demented mother-in-law. Just then, I heard that awful woman demanding to come help her. I found her in the kitchen and she said she overheard that I would have to stay the night. She said that was fine, but that I was going to need to help her with some yard work. I hated yard work, but I guess I didn't really have a choice, so I agreed. She told me that while she was raking, I would have to travel into the woods to gather firewood. I shrugged it off and said fine. The weird thing was that she insisted that I go down this very specific trail in the woods, and she even pointed and directed me right down it. While I was walking down the trail, I started to get a very bad feeling. Then, all of a sudden, my feet got caught up in something, and I was sucked into the air. I had been caught in a trap. My feet were tied together and I was hanging upside down. I began screaming maniacally for help, but I knew nobody could hear me. I knew what must have happened. It was my insane mother-in-law. She must have set this trap while I was on the phone and then set me up to be caught in it. I knew I had to act fast, so I pulled out my phone and dialed for emergency services. I told them the address of my mother-in-law, and they told me they would come as fast as possible. Just then, my mother-in-law came out of the jungle and began laughing at me.
See, now this is what you deserve. You want to act like an animal with my son and go off and get pregnant. Then that's how I'm going to treat you. Now look at you, you're helpless.
You must be completely insane. You're going to regret this. Just then, some officers came out of the jungle with their weapons drawn, and they snuck up behind my mother-in-law. They tackled her to the ground and immediately put cuffs on her. It turns out that they had heard her telling me it's what I deserved, and said that it counted as a confession. They cut me down from my booby trap and helped me up. I explained the whole situation, and they asked me if I wanted to press charges even though she was family. I told them that I would absolutely be pressing charges to the highest extent, and they told me I was making the right decision. The next couple of months were a complete blur. I flew home and was interviewed by many media outlets on my harrowing tale. There were even people that encouraged me to write a book about my experience, and I did, and it actually turned out to be a huge hit. It was around this time that I came to the realization that my husband was a scumbag, and although it was scary to leave him, that I would be far better off without him. I decided that I wanted to divorce him, and that I didn't want anything to do with him. After all, he was abusive to me, and didn't want anything to do with our child, and would be a terrible parent anyways. Of course, it didn't hurt that I was making very good money off of my book sales. He begged me to stay with him, and told me he would be better. But I didn't believe a word he was saying. I kicked him out of our house and got a restraining order after I told the police how he was verbally abusive towards me, and he was forced to live on the streets. As for my mother-in-law, I watched on the news as she was sentenced to 15 years in a maximum security prison for attempting to harm an individual. When I had gone on that trip to her house that day, I had no idea my life would be completely flipped upside down, but everything happens for a reason. Now, my son is going to be born in a couple of months, and I couldn't be more excited. My wealth continues to grow from all of my book sales, and I even recently got an offer to have my book be turned into a major motion picture. Some people say the way I acted towards my husband and his mother was much too harsh, but I disagree. What do you think?